Forget the spaceships or the alien conspiracy theories, because the biggest hoax regarding the Anunnaki gods doesn't lie in where they flew off to, but in why thousands of clay tablets simultaneously kept their mouths shut about that departure. For 4,000 years, the Sumerian scribes, history's biggest workaholics, recorded everything, from kings ascending the throne and bloody wars to beer bills and the number of sheep taken to be roasted, but absolutely nowhere is there a single line written, "Today, the Anunnaki packed their bags and left Earth." This silence is not accidental, and it is certainly not some romantic cosmic mystery. It is a crime scene. The truth is naked, cruel, and much more gritty than you think. The Anunnaki gods never left. It was humanity itself, with shifting politics and new religions that demoted, exiled, and forced them to death right inside our own minds. Welcome back, you brave, curious souls, to dark history. I am Zorro, and today, put away your telescopes, because we won't be looking up at the sky, but digging deep into the dust of time to see what a god who died because they became obsolete looks like. Have you ever wondered what the scariest thing in history is? It's not the bloody wars, it's not the plagues that wiped out half of humanity. No, the scariest thing is silence. The silence in places that were meant to be the loudest. Let me take you back in time, 4,000 years ago, to the land of Mesopotamia, the cradle of human civilization. Imagine you are standing amidst the sacred ruins of Nippur. Here the temple courtyard of Enlil once shook with the sound of drums, hymns, and incense smoke curling up to the high heavens. The soil here, even to this very day, is still soaked in the ash of millions of sacrificial offerings. But today, only silence remains. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists dug up southern Iraq, from Uruk and Lagash to Kish, they found a treasure. Not gold or silver, but knowledge. Layers upon layers of clay tablets stacked like the fossilized thoughts of an entire civilization. Cuneiform, humanity's first writing system. And here is the interesting thing. When it appeared, their writing was already extremely sophisticated. There were no scribbles of children learning to write. The Sumerians recorded their world with brutal precision. King lists, warehouse inventories, laws, and the Anunnaki. Anunnaki. The name that gives scholars headaches and makes internet conspiracy theories explode. The Council of Heaven. Those who decree fate. But hold on to your seats, because this is where things get ironic. When you scan through thousands of clay tablets in the cold museums of Berlin or London, you see the Anunnaki everywhere in the early period. They judge, they bless, they decide which king lives or dies. They are the true bosses of the ancient world. Then, slowly, like a chronic disease, their presence becomes sparse. Their names fade from royal hymns. The temples stop mentioning them. And absolutely not a single inscription from the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, or Assyrians records that. Today, on day X of month Y, the Anunnaki boarded a spaceship and flew away. There was no tearful farewell scene, no fireworks for a send-off. History loves clear endings. A king dies. A city falls. But the Anunnaki? They vanished like a baseless rumor, like a name whispered through too many generations until no one remembers why they were whispering it anymore. I know what you're thinking. Zorro, but the internet says they were aliens. They went back to planet Nibiru to avoid a disaster. Oh, sorry about that. Modern internet mythology certainly has a rich imagination. YouTube channels love to draw scenes of spaceports under the ziggurat temples or shiny metal ships. But look at the truth. A truth that is naked and much more boring. Imagine you are holding a 4,000-year-old clay tablet in your hand. It's small, fits in your palm, covered in the marks of a reed stylus. This is not a spaceship blueprint. This is administrative meeting minutes. The text, Enki and the World Order, lists the Anunnaki as a council assigned specific KPIs. The text, Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld, describes 7 Anunnaki serving as judges in the underworld. They didn't wear silver astronaut suits. They didn't shoot lasers. They were gods of hierarchy, authority, and rules. Living in a Sumerian city meant living under the surveillance of the Anunnaki's human-powered cameras. Each ziggurat temple was their office. Each king was a subordinate employee executing their directives. So what happened? Why did they disappear? Not a big bang, but a personnel overhaul that lasted 2,000 years. Around 2300 BC, when Sargon of Akkad united the city-states, the Anunnaki began to be restructured. An became Anu. Inanna became Ishtar. The Anunnaki were still there, but their power was slashed. By the time Babylon rose, when Marduk was exalted as king of the gods, the Anunnaki were demoted miserably. They went from the supreme board of directors to a backup choir for Marduk. Power? Yes, but only secondary. They showed up when summoned and sat where they were told. By the Neo-Assyrian times, their names rarely appeared. By late Babylonian times, they were just names in the textbooks of old priests. And when new religions like Zoroastrianism or Christianity swept through, the Anunnaki weren't destroyed. They were forgotten. How do you kill a god? You don't need nuclear weapons. You just stop mentioning their name. You stop performing the rituals that make them real in the human mind. I want you to picture this scene. At the Louvre Museum, Paris. There is a boundary stone from the Kassite period. Carved on it are all the symbols of power: stars, crescent moons, mighty beasts. And in a small corner, squeezed between the great gods, is a row of 7 tiny human figures. That is the Anunnaki. The 7 great judges of the underworld, those who once made kings tremble, now drawn tiny as ants, serving as background for the newly rising gods. It is a silent, bitter confession, a public demotion. When looking closely at these clay tablets, you see human traces everywhere. A slip of the scribe's hand. A crack because the clay dried too fast. This is not the work of supermen or aliens. This is the desperate effort of humans to explain forces greater than themselves. The silence in the texts is not because the Anunnaki flew away. It is the silence of a civilization that had grown up. They stopped needing those old nannies to explain why the sun rises or why the floods come. At night, in dark museum archives across the world, thousands of clay tablets still lie there. If you listen closely, that silence isn't empty. It holds the sigh of change. We keep busying ourselves looking for where the Anunnaki went. But perhaps the real question, the question that should make us shudder is, how could the gods leave when from the very beginning they were never separate from our minds? But wait, if they weren't astronauts and they didn't actually leave, then exactly what the hell were the Anunnaki in the eyes of the ancient Sumerians? Why did they have such terrifying power before being forgotten? To answer this, we must step into the very room of an ancient scribe and look at the true nature of the Council of Heaven. And trust me, the truth about their origins is more complex and darker than any conspiracy theory you've ever heard. Welcome to the office of 4,400 years ago. What were you expecting? A spaceship control room with holographic screens? Sorry to disappoint you, this is the workspace of a scribe in the city of Nippur. And the work here, believe me, is boring enough to kill the romance of any sci-fi fan. To understand what the hell happened to the Anunnaki, We must stop looking at them like characters in a Marvel movie. We must look at them through the eyes of the man sitting in this room. To him, writing is not magic. It is administration. On the low table in front of me are still damp clay tablets. In the ceramic jars lining the walls are tons of data, king lists, schedules for sheep offerings, and most importantly, the organizational chart of heaven. Pick up a clay tablet. Feel its coldness and roughness. Here, pressed into the clay with the precision of a tax accountant, are them, the Anunnaki. The naked truth? In the eyes of the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not invaders from planet Nibiru, nor were they geneticists experimenting on humans. They were the bureaucracy of the universe. Listen closely to this. In the oldest texts, the Anunnaki were never described as coming from somewhere else. They simply existed, like the Tigris River, like the Zagros Mountains. They were a default part of reality. Look at the text. The debate between winter and summer. It sounds like a romantic poem, but essentially it is a court transcript. And who is the jury? The Anunnaki. Or the Instructions of Shurupak, the world's oldest self-help book, mentions them as local officials with the power to stamp your fate. But the peak of disillusionment lies in the text Enki and the World Order. In it, the god Enki, the creative CEO, travels the world to assign tasks, or as we call them, JDs, job descriptions. He appoints Nanshi to manage the fish and water birds. He appoints Nisaba to manage the archival department. And what do the Anunnaki do? They sit there, nodding in approval. They are not the engineers building pyramids. They are the board of directors. They are the Senate. They don't hold trowels to build houses. They hold seals to enact laws. Their power doesn't lie in lasers, but in legitimacy. A decree from Enki is only valid once the Anunnaki stamp it approved. Think of them less like astronauts and more like a Supreme Court. Their decision is law, and that law runs the universe. So, in this massive corporation, who is in charge? And why is the disappearance of the Anunnaki so strange? Their authority comes from bloodline. They are called the children of An. Who is An? In Sumerian, An means sky or heaven. But don't be mistaken, he isn't the atmosphere. He is the absentee chairman of the board, residing on the highest level of the universe, completely separated from us mortals. Below the boss An is the power trio, the big three. Enlil, Lord of Wind and Command, the ruthless CEO, ready to hit the flood button if humans get too noisy. Enki, Lord of Wisdom and Fresh Water, the wise CTO, always finding ways to skirt the rules to save humans. Inanna, Goddess of Love and War, the ambitious and unpredictable marketing director. And surrounding these sharks are the Anunnaki, a council of 50 high-ranking gods. Hymns describe them standing in rows, majestic, protecting the me, the cosmic laws of operation. They legitimize kingship. A king in Uruk or Ur cannot declare himself king. He needs the seal of the Anunnaki. Each ziggurat temple is not a radio broadcasting station, but a citizen reception room, the intersection between their realm and ours. They don't study us like lab rats. They rule us like subjects. The relationship is very clear. We provide food via sacrifices. They provide order via laws. This is my favorite part, the part where we, arrogant modern humans, have deluded ourselves. We read Sumerian texts, see the words, descended from heaven, and our brains, poisoned by Hollywood, immediately translate it to, aha, spaceships landing from outer space. Wrong, fatally wrong. The Sumerians had no concept of outer space as a black vacuum containing dead planets. To them, heaven, An, was a solid layer of matter, a divine kingdom located right above, parallel to the ground. When the text says, The Anunnaki descended. They aren't talking about a physical landing. They are using the language of theophany, divine manifestation. It's like a god entering a statue, or stepping through an invisible gate at the top of a ziggurat. It is a shift between spiritual dimensions, not interstellar travel. They didn't wear metal protective gear. They wore woolen cloaks, kaunakis. They didn't fly saucers. They rode on storms and clouds, metaphors for the power of nature. Why is this important? Why am I so intense about the alien thing? Because the truth is scarier than the hypothesis. If they were aliens, their disappearance is easy to understand. They got bored and flew home. The end. But if they weren't tourists, if they were indigenous officials, the holders of the order of this very world, woven into the fabric of reality, then what does their disappearance mean? It means the fabric of reality was torn apart. It means humanity unilaterally terminated the labor contract with the gods. And this is where the story shifts from administration to tragedy. A slow, cruel change took place. A coup in the spiritual world where no one shed blood, but the greatest names were wiped out forever. You think gods are immortal? Mistake. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, gods suffered the same fate as any politician. Ride high, hit rock bottom, and finally be replaced by someone younger, louder, and more ruthless. The disappearance of the Anunnaki isn't a supernatural mystery. It is the result of the most brutal corporate merger in religious history. Let me introduce you to the guy who started this process. Not a god, but a human, Sargon of Akkad. Around 2300 BC, Sargon did what no one had ever done, united the fragmented city-states of Sumer into an empire. And do you know the golden rule of politics? One king on earth, one god in heaven. You cannot rule a unified empire if every city worships a separate board of directors. You need to concentrate power. Under Akkad, the Anunnaki began to be westernized, or more accurately, Akkadianized. They weren't fired immediately, but they were renamed. An became Anu. Inanna became Ishtar. Sounds harmless, right? Just a name change? No. That is the dilution of identity. The scribes still wrote their names, but the status was different. They were no longer independent, wild forces of nature. They were gradually becoming civil servants in a centralized state machine. They were still revered, yes, but that feeling of spine-chilling awe, it was fading. But the real fatal blow landed during the Babylonian era. Imagine Babylon as a rising tech corporation, full of ambition, wanting to swallow the market, and their CEO is Marduk. In the epic Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, we see a perfect political play. The old gods, including the big bosses Anunnaki, are terrified of the monster Tiamat. They tremble. They are helpless. They need a hero. And Marduk steps out. A young guy, strong, and extremely good at negotiating. He says, "I will kill this monster, but on one condition. You must hand over all power to me." The Anunnaki Council, those who once decided the fate of the universe, what do they do now? They nod. They hand the seal of power to Marduk. They accept early retirement. After Marduk wins, what do the Anunnaki become? They become an advisory council. They become the backing choir standing behind Marduk, clapping whenever he makes a decision. From those who held the power over life and death, they became executors, showing up when summoned, keeping silent when not called. That is a subtle humiliation. The Babylonians didn't kill the old gods, they just turned those gods into middle management. Time passed. By the Neo-Assyrian and late Babylonian periods, the name Anunnaki became as rare as an endangered species. In royal inscriptions, where kings bragged about their achievements, they thanked Marduk, they thanked Ashur, they thanked Ishtar. But the Anunnaki? No one mentioned them. Why thank the old board of directors when the new CEO is in charge? The temples that once echoed with hymns for the Anunnaki now stood empty. Dust covered the altars. The sacred fires went out. No one brought sheep for sacrifice anymore. And you know, for a god, no sacrifice means starvation. This is how a real god disappears. Not because they boarded a spaceship and flew away. Not because they were killed in a Star Wars. They died of indifference. They became names in textbooks. Old priests still copied their names in academic lists, but it was soulless copying. No more belief. No more fear. They became semantic ghosts. Look at the big picture. When new religions swept through the Near East, Zoroastrianism turning old gods into demons, Judaism condemning idolatry, and later Christianity declaring victory, the Anunnaki didn't even get the honor of becoming the main enemy. They were too faint to be hated. They were simply forgotten. The world had changed. Humans no longer needed a bureaucratic council of 50 gods to explain why rain falls. They had new theological models, neater, more focused, henotheistic or monotheistic. So there. The biggest mystery isn't where they went. It's what we did to them. We created them when we needed order, and we fired them when we found new orders that were more attractive. You think the Anunnaki are dead? You think after Marduk took power and monotheistic religions swept through, these aging civil servants dissolved into nothingness? Oh no. They have returned. And this time, they have a new look that is much cooler. Look at this screen. Millions of views for videos claiming the Anunnaki are an alien race from Nibiru here to mine gold. They are no longer gods wearing horn caps sitting around counting sheep. Now, they are space travelers, genetic engineers, architects of pyramids. Why? Why after 4,000 years of silence do we dig up their graves and dress them in astronaut suits? The answer lies within us, not them. We, modern humans, are obsessed with technology. We look at the great structures of the past, and our arrogant egos cannot accept that. Ancient people using chisels and hammers could be smarter than us. Therefore, we need a glitterier explanation. We look at the word heaven in Sumerian texts, and instead of understanding it as the sacred realm, we scream outer space. We look at the council that decrees fate, and instead of seeing a court, we see a space fleet command. It's ironic. Those poor Sumerian scribes spent their whole lives meticulously recording laws and order, and 4,000 years later, we turn their work into a script for a B-grade sci-fi movie. If Enlil knew we thought he was a pilot flying a saucer instead of the Lord of Wind, he would probably create another great flood out of anger. So ultimately, if we ignore the cheap conspiracy theories, what is the final truth about the Anunnaki? Where did they go? Listen closely, because this is the deepest part of tonight's story. They didn't go anywhere. They dissolved into the very civilization they helped build, like sugar dissolving in hot water. You no longer see the sugar granules, but the sweetness remains. The hierarchical system that the Anunnaki represented, kings, laws, courts, social order, became the backbone of humanity. We don't need those specific gods anymore, because we have internalized what they represented. When a judge bangs the gavel in a court today, that is the echo of the Anunnaki. When we look up at the sky and divide an hour into 60 minutes, that is the legacy of Sumerian mathematics sponsored by the Anunnaki. They didn't leave Earth. They became part of humanity's operating system. In the Louvre Museum, The Kassite boundary stone with the image of 7 tiny Anunnaki gods still lies there, silent behind bulletproof glass. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the silence of parents when their children have grown up and moved out to live on their own. The history of the Anunnaki is not a story about aliens coming and going. It is a story about human consciousness. In the beginning, we feared the dark, feared thunder, feared chaos. We created the Anunnaki, a council of order, to feel safe. We needed great nannies to tell us what to do. But then, over millennia, we began to understand the world. We found the laws of the seasons, of the stars, of politics. And when we understood, the fear vanished. When the fear vanished, the old gods faded as well. How does a god disappear? Not by flying to Mars, but by us stopping our need for them. Close your eyes. Imagine you are standing in modern southern Iraq, but turn the clock back 5,000 years. The heat scorches your skin. The smell of donkey dung, the smell of dry mud, and most pungent of all, the smell of blood mixed with incense. You are standing at the foot of an architectural monster, a ziggurat. We often call it a temple. Mistake. That is not a church where you go to confess on Sunday. That is a machine, a giant artificial mountain house, Ekur, where layers of mud brick rise to pierce the sky, forcing heaven and earth to touch, whether they want to or not. In each Sumerian city-state, this machine operates for a different boss. In Nippur, it's Enlil. In Uruk, it's the fickle and cruel goddess Inanna. In Eridu, it's the wise Enki. But look closer into the shadows behind their thrones. There are others lurking there. Climb those steps with me. Don't drop the bread and beer in your hands. You will need them to bribe for your safety. At the top of the tower, the priests aren't praying. They are working. They feed the god statues, change their clothes, burn aromatic wood. You think this is the superstition of primitive savages? Oh no, my friend. This is technology. This is a system maintaining the hydraulic pressure of the universe. The Sumerians believed, as long as the rituals ran according to procedure, the gods would stay. And as long as the gods stayed, this world would not disintegrate into nothingness. It's like you have to fuel a nuclear reactor. Stop fueling it, and boom. But who actually operates this reactor? It is the Anunnaki. They are not the gods you pray to for harvest or victory. They are too big for those petty things. They are the Constitution. They are the Supreme Court. They are the biggest shareholders in this cosmic corporation. When kings put on the cloak of divinity, it is the Anunnaki who sign that labor contract. But this is where things get interesting and dangerous. If you read the ancient texts carefully, like a true detective and not a tourist just skimming the surface, you will realize a fatal flaw in the Anunnaki's design. They are everywhere, but they have no faces. We know how hot-tempered Enlil is. We know how promiscuous Inanna is. But the Anunnaki? They are a collective block, a congress, an abstract plural. They are like the concept of the government or the board. Supreme power, but invisible. And in the brutal history of humanity, whatever is abstract is easily manipulated. A god with a name, a specific temple, and fanatical priests protecting them is very hard to overthrow. But a council, a committee? My friend, you can dissolve a committee with just a paper and a pen, if you have enough power. The Anunnaki are the principle of order, the frame keeping the other gods together. But when earthly order changes, that frame becomes cramped. And when new wolves appear on the steppe, they don't need old principles. They need absolute power. Fast forward to 2334 BC. While scribes in Nippur were still diligently pressing the names of the Anunnaki into wet clay, the ground began to shake. A storm was coming from the north, and the name of that storm was Sargon. He was not Sumerian. He was Akkadian. He spoke a different language, thought differently. And most importantly, he had an ambition that no madman before him dared to dream. He didn't want to be king of a city. He wanted to be king of everything. Sargon swept through southern Mesopotamia like a hot knife cutting through butter. He united independent city-states, creating humanity's first true empire. But Sargon was smart enough to know that you cannot rule by swords and spears alone. You need to rule both the dreams and fears of the people. A massive corporate merger took place in heaven. Sargon's scribes began rewriting the files. They didn't delete the Sumerian gods. That would be stupid. They translated those gods. The god An turned into Anu. Inanna molted into Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, bloodier, more brutal. Enki became Ea. But what about the Anunnaki, our Supreme Council? In Sargon's new imperial order, democracy was a luxury item. A single king on Earth needed a corresponding reflection in the sky. A council sharing power? Sounds so outdated. In Akkadian royal inscriptions, the Anunnaki were still mentioned, but the tone had changed. They began to fade. From the position of holders of the supreme seal, they gradually turned into a generic crowd of great gods. The sharp constitutional structure of the past was being softened, bent to serve a new purpose. Sargon's empire collapsed after 2 centuries, a blink of an eye in history. Sumerian cities rose again, trying to restore the old order, trying to put the Anunnaki back in the judge's seat. But Pandora's box had been opened. Humans had tasted the flavor of centralized power. And the gods. They were about to undergo the most ruthless purge in theological history. Because another giant was rising from Babylon, and this guy didn't just want to change the names of the gods, he wanted to rewrite the entire structure of the universe. (1792 BC). Remember this timeline. This is the moment the rules of the game changed forever. A man named Hammurabi stepped onto the throne in Babylon. At that time, Babylon was just a small dot on the map, a second-rate city sandwiched between giants. But Hammurabi was not one to settle. For 43 long years, he used swords, money, and his silver tongue to swallow everything. He turned Babylon from a dusty town into the center of the universe. But Hammurabi knew a secret that every great dictator knows. Conquering the land is not enough. You must conquer the sky as well. As Babylon rose, its patron god, Marduk, had to rise with it. But there was a small problem. Marduk, how do I put this, had a rather humble background. Before Hammurabi, Marduk was just a B-list god, the son of Ea, Enki, a guy who managed water and vegetation. Important? Yes. Supreme power? No way. How do you turn an irrigation department manager into the emperor of the universe? You need a top-tier marketing campaign. You need a story. You need a legal justification for usurpation. And so the Enuma Elish was born. Historians call the Enuma Elish the epic of creation. I call it the greatest political propaganda document of all time. Its content is not meant to lull children to sleep. It is an indictment to take down the old regime, which is our Anunnaki Council. The story goes like this. The universe is in chaos. The old generation of gods, represented by the Anunnaki, is powerless. A primordial monster rises. Tiamat, the goddess of the salt sea, mother of all monsters. She wants to tear the noisy young gods apart. What does the Anunnaki Council do? They panic. They tremble. None of the big shots of the past, not Anu, not Enlil, dare to stand up and face her. Their impotence is exposed nakedly before everyone's eyes. And then, Marduk steps out. Imagine this scene. A young guy, rippling muscles, blinding aura, walks into the trembling council meeting room. He makes an offer that reeks of blackmail. I will kill that monster, but on one condition. If I win, this council dissolves. My power is supreme. My word is law. The Anunnaki council, backed into a corner, nods. The battle takes place. Marduk slaughters Tiamat, splitting her body in two like splitting a dried fish to create heaven and earth. Blood flows like rivers, and from those ashes, a new order is established. This is the most important moment, the moment when the primitive democracy of the gods was strangled. After the victory, Marduk didn't go back to being a normal god. He reorganized the entire HR department of heaven. In the Enuma Elish, there's a chilling passage describing the scene of the Anunnaki bowing before Marduk. They didn't just bow in greeting. They surrendered power. Anu, the aging chairman of the board, officially handed over the seal to Marduk and declared, "From now on, your command is supreme." What happened to the 50 great gods who once sat on the Supreme Council? Were they fired? No, much worse. They were demoted. They were given new tasks: building temples for Marduk, serving in Marduk's court, running errands for Marduk. Do you see the irony here? Before, the Anunnaki were the decision makers. Now, they are the decision executors. Before, they were the parliament. Now they are the secretariat. Before, they determined fate. Now they receive fate from Marduk's hands. The constitutional structure was wiped out. Absolute monarchy took the throne. This change wasn't just in the stories. It seeped into every line of text, every prayer of the Babylonian people. If you read texts from this period, the grammar changed ruthlessly. Before, the Anunnaki decided they were the subject. Now, Marduk commanded the Anunnaki. They were the object. They were still called the great gods, still revered, but their function had been hollowed out. Imagine a supreme court that still exists in name, but its only duty is to stamp approved on every decree of the king. That was the fate of the Anunnaki. Hammurabi did in heaven what he did on earth. Dozens of independent city-states had to kneel before Babylon, so dozens of independent gods also had to kneel before Marduk. The Anunnaki, from architects of the universe, now became a massive bureaucracy serving a single divine emperor. But their tragedy didn't stop there. When their power in heaven was stripped away, when they became redundant in the palaces of light, they began to drift. And in the human imagination, when a god loses their throne on high, there is only one place left for them to go: down, deep underground, into the darkness. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and this rhyme usually smells of blood. After Babylon set the precedent that a king on earth needs a boss in heaven, this model became the gold standard. Look to the north. The Assyrians, the most brutal war machines of the ancient world, were rising. They looked at Hammurabi's theological blueprint and said, "This is good, but we will use it for Ashur." Ashur, their patron god, was immediately pumped full of power to become the supreme being. Ashur swallowed the attributes of Marduk. And guess what happened to our old friends, the Anunnaki? They changed owners again. This wasn't oppression. This was dissolution. Under the Neo-Assyrian period, around 800 BC, the Anunnaki became something very industrial. They were like screws in the empire's war machine. They were a floating category. In royal inscriptions, their names gradually disappeared. The kings were so lazy they just referred to them collectively as all the great gods, or gods of heaven and earth. Why remember the name of each council member when they no longer had decision-making power? The Anunnaki went from a powerful board of directors holding the life of the universe down to Marduk's secretariat, and now they were just the honor guard serving as a background for Asher. They were prestigious, yes, but they were redundant. An institution designed for a multipolar world suffocated in the unipolar world of empires. But the most haunting question tonight isn't how they lost power. It is, where did they go? When you get kicked out of the penthouse of the universe, you can't just hover in the lobby forever. You have to go down. And in Mesopotamian mythology, down means a very specific, very terrifying place. In post-Old Babylonian texts, a silent geographical shift took place. The Anunnaki began to appear in places no one expected, not in gold-plated temples, not in assemblies on the clouds. They appeared in Kur, the underworld, the kingdom of eternal darkness. They weren't there on vacation. They were there as resident officers. The gods who once held the sky now became wardens, judges of the dead. They drifted from the dazzling heights down to the darkest abyss. And for you to understand just how terrifying that feeling of going down is, I will tell you a story. A surreal nightmare that the Sumerians left for us. The story is called Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the proudest and most powerful one, decided to visit her sister Ereshkigal, the mistress of the underworld. Why? No one knows. Perhaps territorial ambition, or a deadly curiosity. She prepared as carefully as if going to a coronation party. 7 layers of divine garments, a dazzling crown, a royal scepter, a measuring rod of life. She was the embodiment of power. But hell has its own rules. The underworld has 7 gates, and at each gate a part of the divine ego is stripped away. Gate 1. Click. The gatekeeper snatches the crown from her head. Why? She asks. Do not ask, Inanna. This is the law of the underworld. Gate 2. Click. Earrings are removed. Gate 3. Click. The pearl necklace is snapped off. Gate 4. Click. The cloak of power falls to the ground, just like that, layer by layer. It wasn't just jewelry, that was the me, divine power, identity, the great ego of a god. She was stripped naked in both the literal and figurative sense. When Inanna stepped through the 7th gate, she was no longer the Queen of Heaven. She was naked. She was trembling. She was helpless. She was just a piece of fresh meat walking into a predator's den. And waiting for her there in the thick darkness was not just her hate-filled sister Ereshkigal, but also them, old friends, those who had been pushed down here from before, the Anunnaki Council. They were sitting there, not to welcome her, but to judge her. We stopped at the most terrifying moment of Mesopotamian mythology. Inanna, Queen of the Universe, standing naked and trembling before her sister's throne in hell. And surrounding her were 7 judges, 7 Anunnaki. Look closely at them right now. They are no longer the flashy architects of the sky. They aren't sitting around drinking beer and discussing politics. Here, in this darkness, they are the embodiment of a power more ancient and ruthless than any earthly king, death. The ancient text describes this scene in a spine-chilling way. The Anunnaki, the 7 judges, pronounced judgment against her. They looked at her with the eyes of death. They spoke words against her, words of wrath. No debate, no defense attorney, just a look. And the result? Inanna, the powerful god who once conquered the sky, who made kings kneel, was turned into a rotting corpse. She was hung on a hook, like a slab of pork in a butcher shop, a soulless, cold, rotting piece of meat on the wall. This was the sweet revenge of the Anunnaki. Up in the sky, Marduk might be king, but down here, in the crypts of existence, the Anunnaki are the law. Here, even the Queen of Heaven is just meat and bone. The story should have ended there. A perfect Game of Thrones ending. But this is mythology, and VIP gods always have a back door. Enki, the wise god, and the one who always finds loopholes, created two tiny, sexless creatures to sneak down to hell. They didn't use force. They used empathy to soften the heart of the underworld queen Ereshkigal. They sprinkled food of life and water of life on the corpse on the hook. Inanna revived. But the Anunnaki are not easily outsmarted. They blocked her path right at the exit. The law of hell is absolute. If you want to leave, you must leave a substitute. No one, not even a god, is allowed to break the balance of death's accounting books. The Anunnaki sent demons, the debt collectors of the underworld, to follow Inanna up to the surface to ensure she fulfilled the deal. And whom did Inanna choose? Not an enemy. She chose Dumuzi, her husband, because while she was suffering torture in hell, this precious husband wasn't mourning at all. He was wearing brocade robes, sitting on a throne and enjoying power. "Take him," Inanna ordered, and the demons of the Anunnaki dragged Dumuzi down into the abyss. Justice served. The books were balanced. What does this story say about the fate of the Anunnaki? Look back at their strange journey through millennia of Mesopotamian history. Initially, they were the Supreme Council. They were the holders of the blueprint of the universe. They decided kings, harvests, wars. They were the light. But when humans began building empires, when earthly kings concentrated power into a single person, Sargon Hammurabi, we restructured the sky. We didn't need a democratic council anymore. We needed a dictatorial god-king like Marduk or Asher. So we pushed the Anunnaki to the fringe. We stripped them of legislative power. We turned them into paper-pushing officials. And finally, when they became redundant in the light, we pushed them into the darkness. They became the judges of hell, chthonic judges. They became the terrifying faces you would meet when taking your last breath. They no longer represented the order of life, but represented the immutability of death and fate. That is not decline. That is transformation. The Anunnaki became the shadow of civilization. As the light of empires grew brighter, the shadow at their feet grew darker, and the Anunnaki hid in that shadow. Time passed, and something darker happened. The name Anunnaki began to stick to the darkness like a magnet to iron. In incantations in Akkadian, the tone of the priests began to change. They no longer called the Anunnaki princes of the sky. They whispered spine-chilling phrases, Anunnaki of the underworld, or Anunnaki dwelling in darkness. They went from cosmic legislators, architects of reality, to become a supreme court of death. Picture this to make it easy to understand. It's like the board of directors of a global corporation suddenly being transferred down to work as morgue security guards. Still have power, yes, but it is power over soulless corpses. Why did this happen? The history of religion, ladies and gentlemen, is more brutal than any war. When a new order rises, the old gods don't simply disappear. No, they are pushed down. We see this scenario repeated everywhere. When Zeus and the young, muscular Olympian gods took the mountain peak, the aging titans were cast down into deep Tartarus. When Christianity came to Europe, the old gods didn't die. They grew horns and tails to become demons in hell. In Ireland, the mighty Tuatha De Danann had to retreat into the hollow hills, becoming lurking ghosts. In Mesopotamia, the process was subtler. When the god Marduk rose to become king of the gods, when the new Babylonian empires wanted to honor their own patron gods, The Anunnaki were submerged. No bloody war was recorded. Just simply, they were forgotten in high places. Layer by layer of text, their domain shifted from the deep blue sky down to the pitch-black earth. But, and this is where history's irony becomes most bitter, there is a strange dignity in this demotion. Look at the Mesopotamian underworld. Don't confuse it with Dante's fiery inferno or the Christian lake of fire. No, it was duller, and in my opinion, much more terrifying. It was a vast region of darkness where the dead existed in a diminished state. They ate dust. They chewed clay. They sat in eternal darkness, not in extreme pain, but with no joy either. Just a weary existence. Someone had to manage that boring mess, right? Who had enough authority to keep order for billions of souls gnawing on dirt? The new gods, the rising stars, were too busy receiving offerings and wine on earth. They didn't want to get involved in that filthy place. So they handed the keys to the Anunnaki. Perhaps it was an honor, that the Anunnaki were too ancient, too powerful to be completely wiped out, so they were granted dominion over a separate kingdom. A kingdom of endings, of memory and exhausted pasts. Those who once witnessed the beginning of the universe now sit there, witnessing the end of every human life. Or was it a sugar-coated exile? I lean towards the second hypothesis. Think about it. Underworld judges have power, true, but it is reactive power. They only judge what is sent to them. They no longer have the ability to create. They cannot command the sun to rise, cannot make rainfall, cannot decide which dynasty will flourish. They were politically castrated. They sat on underground thrones, holding titles that sounded majestic, but were completely harmless to the world of the living. The priests and scribes of that time were very clever. They didn't want to anger the nostalgic folks, so they didn't publicly humiliate the old gods. They performed a quiet personnel reorganization. The Anunnaki were promoted down to the underworld, a promotion that everyone knew was the end of a career. The most painful part lies in the contrast. Remember Inanna? She was hung on that meat hook for 3 days and 3 nights. The world above began to die without her. Plants withered, animals stopped breeding. The universe screamed for her return. And finally, she was rescued. She was allowed to revive and rise, bringing life back to Earth. But the Anunnaki? No one came to rescue them. There were no rituals to bring them back to the sky. No harvests awaited their resurrection. Inanna was just a tourist in the underworld, while the Anunnaki, they were permanent prisoners. They were locked in darkness, forever judging the endless stream of dead passing before them. The question I want to plant in your heads right now is, did they choose to stay there, or were they forced to stay? Is this a functional transition, or a life sentence without parole? And more importantly, if they were demoted like that underground, then what awaits them when new historical forces, more ruthless, more absolute, begin to appear on the horizon? Because, ladies and gentlemen, being demoted to King of Hell is still not the worst thing. The real erasure is still ahead. While the Anunnaki were busy stamping files for clay-eating souls in the darkness of Mesopotamia, in the east, another storm was forming. A storm that brought no rain or thunder, but brought something 10,000 times more dangerous. A new idea. Let's take our eyes off the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for a moment. We will move to the windy Iranian plateau around the 6th century BC. Here, a man named Zarathustra, or as the West often calls him, Zoroaster, stepped into the light and dropped an atomic bomb on the old divine order. He didn't care who sat in which chair in the Council of Gods. He came to tell the world, You guys were wrong from the very beginning. Zarathustra did not preach about a council of gods sitting at a round table discussing where it should rain this year. No, he painted a much more brutal and simple picture: cosmic dualism. In his vision, the universe is a bloody battlefield between two absolute factions. In the blue corner, Ahura Mazda, Lord of Truth and Light. In the red corner, Angra Mainyu, Spirit of Chaos and Deceit. That's it. No gray area, no neutral faction. And this is where things get extremely bad for our old friends, the Anunnaki. According to these new rules, every soul, every regional god, every force that humans had bowed down to for thousands of years had to pick a side. And guess what? In the eyes of Zoroastrianism, the old gods did not belong to the side of light. This is where we witness something even more cruel than demotion: theological erasure. In Zoroastrian scripture, the majestic gods of Mesopotamia were not considered worthy opponents. They were labeled Daevas. Do you know what this word means? It doesn't mean defeated God. It means deceitful spirits, imposters, spiritual pyramid schemers who tricked humanity into believing false things for generations. Feel the weight of this blow. When Cyrus the Great of Persia marched his army to conquer Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't just bring swords and spears. He brought an ideological weapon. Previously, the Anunnaki were pushed down to the underworld. Well, that was sad, but at least they were still gods. They still had titles, still had a domain, even if that domain was full of dust. But under the lens of Zoroastrianism, they were stripped of the right to exist. They were not exiled kings. They were lies. Zarathustra and his followers declared that the entire complex social structure, where many gods ruled the world together, was spiritually bankrupt. The Anunnaki, who were once worshipped, once offered sacrifices, were now considered dangerous illusions leading humans away from the only true cosmic order of Ahura Mazda. This isn't just religion. This is politics. This is psychological warfare at its peak. As the intellectual class in Mesopotamia began to absorb this ideology, the power base of the old gods began to crack from the inside. You cannot worship a god if you start suspecting that he is just a demon playing a role. But, ladies and gentlemen, if you think Persia was the only one stabbing the old gods in the back, you are mistaken. In the West, a group of exiles was going through an existential crisis, and the way they solved that crisis would create a permanent knockout punch for the concept of polytheism. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, yes, Babylon again, made a historic mistake. He burned Jerusalem and dragged the Jewish elite back to Babylon as captives. He thought doing so would extinguish their will. But he was wrong. In the furnace of exile, amidst the giant ziggurats and magnificent temples of the enemy, the Jewish exiles did not give up. They began to rewrite the script. And in this new script, the Anunnaki would no longer have a place, not even a place in the dark. We are in Babylon, the 6th century BC. Look around. This is the center of the world. The blue glazed walls of the Ishtar Gate reach for the high heavens. Giant ziggurats pierce the clouds, and the golden palanquin processions of the god Marduk move through the streets amidst the sound of trumpets and curling smoke. For a shepherd from Judea who had just been taken prisoner, this place should have been undeniable proof that their God is stronger than my God. After all, they won. They burned Solomon's temple to ash. But history always takes weird turns. Instead of kneeling before Marduk and the Anunnaki, these Jewish exiles did something much more daring. They retreated into the shadows, lit a candle, and began to write. And in that flickering candlelight, they executed the greatest coup in religious history. Open the first pages of Genesis. Does it look familiar? The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the primordial waters. It sounds exactly like the cosmological framework of Mesopotamia, but there is a deadly difference. In Mesopotamia, creation was a war, a chaotic mess of gods fighting each other. And here, there is only one voice, one command: let there be light. And light appeared. No debate, no voting, no council needed to approve the budget. This is when the Anunnaki were dealt a fatal blow, not by swords and spears, but by administrative restructuring. The Jewish priests were very smart. They didn't completely erase the concept of the divine council, the backbone structure of the Anunnaki. You still see it peeking out in the book of Job or the Psalms, where God meets with the sons of God, Elohim. But look closely at this meeting room. In the old Sumerian version, the Anunnaki were shareholders, co-rulers. They had veto power. They had their own domains. In the new biblical version, they are just interns. They became messengers, angels, or petty officials who only knew how to nod and take notes. They were no longer competitors for power. They had been stripped of their voting rights. Yahweh, the sole God of Israel, accepted no power sharing. He is the CEO, the chairman of the board, and the sole shareholder. This transition was cruel in that it stripped the old gods of their dignity. The Anunnaki went from cosmic legislators down to errand boys. But the biblical authors didn't stop there. They had a linguistic weapon even sharper: contempt. They didn't call the old gods by name. Naming them would give the enemy too much power, too much recognition. Instead, they used offensive slang. They called the gods of other nations Elim. Do you know what this word means? It doesn't mean evil gods. It means worthless things, trash, rejects, or they called them Avodah Zarah, strange service. Imagine you are a god once worshipped by millions, who once decided the lives of kings, and now a group of exiles calls you worthless. The God of Israel didn't need to defeat Marduk or the Anunnaki in an epic Marvel-style battle. He simply declared them irrelevant. According to this brutal logic, the Anunnaki weren't overthrown enemies. They were hallucinations. They were straw men that foolish humanity had erected. This doctrine declared, there is a God who needs no food, goodbye meat offerings, no sleep, no temple, because he is everywhere, and most importantly, no advisory council. Everything else, all the statues, the temples, the complex theological systems of Mesopotamia, was swept into a trash bin named idolatry. It was a fundamental cognitive error, like worshiping the hammer instead of the carpenter. When Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, they carried this theological weapon of mass destruction in their luggage. And as Judaism developed, the cage for the Anunnaki became tighter and tighter. Prophets began to mock mercilessly. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, feet but cannot walk. They turned the terrifying gods of old into lifeless logs, motionless stones. The theological space where the Anunnaki once breathed had been sucked dry of air. They had nowhere left to hide. They couldn't be in the sky. Yahweh was already there. Couldn't be underground. Hell was no longer their kingdom, but just a place of punishment or waiting. And now, they weren't even allowed to exist as sentient entities. But if you think this humiliation was the end, just wait. A new force was about to emerge from the ruins of the Roman Empire. A force that wasn't content with just mocking, but wanted to hunt. Judaism said the Anunnaki were worthless. Christianity was about to declare that they were something much more dangerous. They weren't lifeless wood and stone. They were demons. If Judaism was the grumpy neighbor standing on the other side of the fence, mocking the Anunnaki as useless, then Christianity was the SWAT team kicking down the door and smashing everything. When Christianity appeared, the game changed completely. They inherited the monotheistic gene of Judaism, but they added something more dangerous: urgency. They didn't just want to keep themselves pure. They wanted to save the whole world. And to save the world, they had to destroy those who were ruling it spiritually. The Apostle Paul didn't beat around the bush. He stated bluntly, "The gods of the nations are demons." Hear that cracking sound? That is the sound of the Anunnaki's last mask being smashed. They were no longer cosmic administrators, no longer melancholy judges of the underworld. Now, they were the enemy. The book of Revelation, the most cinematic horror work of the Bible, turned Babylon from a historical empire into the great whore, drunk on the blood of saints, sitting on a scarlet beast. Everything that Babylon and the Anunnaki represented, ziggurats, incense, hierarchy, was labeled as the opposite of truth. And when Christianity seized the power of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, theological arguments turned into physical violence. This was the ultimate humiliation: adaptive reuse of facilities. Temples were closed or, worse, baptized. Places that were once the Anunnaki's intersection between heaven and earth had their symbols smashed, were sprinkled with holy water, and turned into churches for a different god. The gods who once received offerings were now considered demons hiding in the cracks, deceiving the foolish. The Anunnaki weren't defeated in a fiery battle. They were suffocated. The logic of monotheism strangled their existence. If there is only one god, the Anunnaki cannot be gods. If they aren't gods but still have power, they must be demons. There is no third option. But the final sword strike, the strike that finished off their public existence, came from the Arabian desert in the 7th century. When Islamic armies swept through Mesopotamia, they brought the cold decisiveness of the desert. The Quran didn't argue with the old gods. It erased them with the concept of Tawhid, the absolute unity of God. No sons, no daughters, no partners, no counsel. Anyone who dared to associate another name with Allah committed shirk, the unforgivable sin. By the time the door of the last temple closed, somewhere in the mist of history, the Anunnaki had suffered the most brutal triple erasure. Politically, they were demoted from cosmic legislators to desk clerks. Theologically, they were kicked out of heaven down to the basement of the underworld. Ontologically, monotheism declared they never truly existed. They were mirages, a big fat zero. They didn't die. They were declared unreal. The question was no longer, what should we offer to Enlil? But why are you talking to a rock? And that, my friends, is how gods die. Not with a bang, but with a long yawn of history. But I am Zorro, and I don't believe in absolute endings. Look at those ruins. The temples are closed, but the stones remain, stubbornly challenging time. The rituals have ceased, but the cycles they marked, the sowing season, the flood season, life and death, continue exactly as they did thousands of years ago. Erasure is never complete. Religious memory is a stubborn thing. The Anunnaki may no longer sit on the throne in Nippur, but they have dissolved into the foundation of human civilization. They hide in the way we divide an hour into 60 minutes, thanks to the Sumerians, in the way we look up at the constellations, and in the primal fear of the darkness underground. They didn't disappear. They just went underground, literally and figuratively, waiting in the depths of the human subconscious. And who knows? In our strangest dreams, perhaps the council is still in session. We are often taught that history is a straight line, that old gods died, making way for the one supreme being, that when temples collapsed, belief also vanished with the dust. But you know what? History isn't that clean. It's messy, it's persistent, and it's full of ghosts that refuse to lie still in their graves. Imagine an old woman in the Iraqi countryside whispering forbidden names into her grandchild's ear when the Orthodox priests have turned away. Whose names are those? The Anunnaki, those who fell from the sky, the first architects of human civilization. Look at this map. We will leave the empty corpse of Babylon, go up the Euphrates, cross the blood-soaked lands of modern-day Syria to reach southeastern Turkey. There, amidst the scorching heat of the rolling plains, a city appears like a mirage. Haran, or as the ancients called it, Haranu. If you are a devout believer, you know this place. The Hebrew Bible says this was the stopover for Abraham's family before reaching the promised land of Canaan. A perfect spiritual tourist spot, right? But that is just the outer coat of paint. The biblical authors, the PR masters of that era, very cleverly forgot to mention the true identity of this city. Haran wasn't just a stopover. It was the Mecca of a god a millennium older than Abraham. It was the city of Sin, the moon god, or as the Sumerians called him, Nana. Do you know what the crazy thing is? The worship of Sin didn't die with Babylon. It didn't die when Alexander the Great passed through. It even survived the rise of Christianity. More than 1,000 years after the Mesopotamian empires collapsed, when Islam had cast its shadow over the entire Middle East in Haran, people still bowed to the moonlight. Fast forward to the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Arab historians arrived in Haran, and what the hell did they see? A strange community. They wore distinctive robes that you only see on ancient reliefs. They performed astronomical rituals, calculating star orbits with terrifying precision. Their temples had no crosses, no Islamic crescents, but were decorated with planetary symbols. Who were they? They called themselves Sabians. And this is where the story gets interesting in a crime movie way. In the Islamic world at that time, you had 3 choices: convert, die, or be people of the book, meaning Jews, Christians, groups protected by the Quran. But there was a mysterious third group mentioned in the Quran, the Sabians. No one really knew for sure who the Sabians in the original scripture were. Realizing this legal loophole, the stubborn pagans in Haran executed a genius conceptual bait and switch. They stood before the Islamic judges and boldly declared, "Yes, we are the very Sabians mentioned in your holy book." Do you see the irony? They, the last worshippers of the Mesopotamian stars, used the very scripture of the religion that wanted to erase them to protect their existence. They hid in plain sight, protected by law to continue worshiping gods that the world had declared dead. Inside those temples, what was actually happening? Historian al-Masudi and philosopher al-Biruni recorded what they saw, though they probably shuddered. A prayer system directed at the 7 classical planets. Sacred texts written in ancient Syriac. Astronomical knowledge preserved intact from the time Babylonian priests stood atop ziggurats. Although the Sabians might not have shouted the name Anunnaki during ceremonies, look at the operating system they were running. They believed divine power operated through celestial bodies. They believed correct rituals kept the universe from collapsing. They believed planets were broadcasting stations of the gods. This is exactly the worldview of the Sumerians. The god Sin of the city of Ur, the old father of the gods, was still being nourished by these prayers. More than 3,000 years after the ziggurat at Ur was built, its source code was still running in the background at Haran, camouflaged under the name Sabian. But Haran was just a floating fortress. In the deep rural areas where the king's laws couldn't reach, another type of memory virus was silently spreading, and this time it involved a tear-soaked death. If Haran was where intellectuals protected the stars with slippery wisdom, then in the countryside the story played out in a much more visceral way. Welcome to the world of farmers. Here, people don't care much about high-minded theological debates. They care about whether rice grows, whether rain falls, and whether they will starve to death next winter. And this need for survival nourished one of the most persistent ghosts of Mesopotamian history. His name was Tammuz, or if you want to call him by his Sumerian birth name, Dumuzi. Let me introduce this guy. Tammuz wasn't a god sitting on a throne commanding thunder. He was a tragic god. He was the lover of Inanna, goddess of love and war, the shepherd king, and most importantly, he had to die. Every year, when the harsh summer hit Mesopotamia, plants withered, river water ran dry, and people believed Tammuz had died and gone to the underworld. His departure took the life of all things with it, and for him to return, someone had to mourn. You think this is just nonsense mythology? Look closer. The Jewish prophet Ezekiel, an extremely serious man who hated paganism with a passion, went crazy in the 6th century BC. Why? Because when he went to the north gate of the temple in Jerusalem, yes, right at the holy site of Yahweh, what did he see? Israelite women sitting there weeping bitterly. They weren't crying for their sins. They were weeping for Tammuz. Let's pause a moment to feel this irony. Jerusalem was the fortress of monotheism. But right at God's doorstep, these women were still performing a ritual for an ancient Sumerian god. For Ezekiel, it was unforgivable blasphemy. But for those women, it was agricultural insurance. Yahweh might be great, but Tammuz was the one who helped the crops revive. The interesting thing is that Ezekiel couldn't stop it. The old gods were very good at hiding in the shadows. Folk religion is like water. It seeps through every crack of orthodox dogma. 800 years after Ezekiel complained, that is nearly a millennium passing, Father Jerome of the Christian Church had to hold his head in frustration. He discovered that farmers in the Levant, modern-day Eastern Mediterranean, were still holding rituals for Tammuz. 800 years. Empires had fallen, kings had died, Jesus had been born, and Christianity had spread. But these stubborn farmers refused to give up the habit of weeping for their summer god. Why? Because it worked psychologically. These rituals connected them to the land, to the cycle of planting and harvesting. You can rename the god, you can repaint the statue, but you cannot erase the fear of hunger and the hope for a bountiful harvest. Medieval Arab documents tell us that, even when Islam dominated in Iraq and Syria, women still gathered in the hot month of July, the month they bluntly called the month of Tammuz in their calendar, to sing laments. Maybe they changed the lyrics. Maybe they said they were crying for some accepted religious figure, like Hussein or a martyr. But look at its structure. The timing is summer. The emotion is tragic grief. The purpose is to pray for rebirth. It is old wine in new bottles. Tammuz still lived, hiding right in the cries of those trying to forget him. We must understand these weren't organized cults with membership cards or catechisms. There was no Church of Tammuz. This is what I call the network of grandmothers. These customs survived because grandma taught mom, and mom taught daughter. Cry like this in July, child, or the rice will die. Simple as that. Theology was long lost. The deep meaning of Inanna's love might have been forgotten, but the gesture remained, just like how you knock on wood when saying something unlucky, or how you throw salt over your shoulder. Do you remember which god you are invoking when doing that? No. You just do it because it brings a feeling of safety. The rituals for Tammuz were the same. They became fragments of memory, unconditioned reflexes of culture, a perfect syncretism where the boundaries between religions were blurred by the reality of life. However, nothing lasts forever under the weight of time and oppression. Though these echoes were persistent, the pressure from religious authorities was relentless. Christian bishops hunted down pagan remnants like hunting witches. Islamic authorities tightened regulations on religious practice. The accumulation of centuries began to erode the most stubborn rocks. In Haran, the Sabian community we spoke of earlier finally couldn't hold out. Temples were smashed, rebuilt, then smashed again. By the 11th century, they weakened. By the 13th century, the last records of them disappeared. And in the countryside, the old grandmothers eventually passed away. At some point, this fragile connection would snap. And that is when we witness the true death of a god. Not in a Hollywood-style epic battle, but in the terrifying silence of oblivion. What does the death of a god look like? Hollywood teaches us that it must be epic. Thunder, earthquakes, the sky ripping apart, and a scream echoing through the universe. But Hollywood lies. In reality, gods die like an oil lamp running out of fuel. It flickers, weakly, then goes out. No one notices. No one cares. Somewhere, in a year, history didn't bother to record. Maybe the 13th century, or later. A man performed the final ritual for the god Sin. Picture that man. Probably a senile old man in the eyes of his neighbors. He stood before a makeshift altar, mumbling prayers in a language his descendants no longer understood, sounds stretching from Sumerian times, through Babylon, through Assyria, piercing through 3,000 years of history to linger on those dry lips. He didn't know he was the last one. He didn't know that when he fell, the chain connecting humanity to the Anunnaki would snap forever. No game over notification. No credits rolling at the end of the movie. He simply died. And his son, or his grandson, looked at that old altar and decided, this pile of trash is taking up too much space. Let's clear it out. That was it. In another village, a great-grandmother tried to teach her granddaughter the lament song of Tammuz. But that girl? She was busy worrying about how to integrate with her husband's family, who were strict Muslims. She didn't want to be seen as backward. That song was never sung again. It died right in the throat of the next generation. Oblivion doesn't come from hatred, it comes from indifference. That is the cruelest way to erase an existence. But the tragedy doesn't stop at whispers. It is also present right on the stones. Look at what remains of the mighty Anunnaki. The great ziggurat of Ur, once the broadcasting station of the god Nana. When the Euphrates River changed course, the city died of thirst and was abandoned. The illustrious temple became a useless mound in the middle of the desert. And the temple of Enlil in Nippur, the Pentagon of Sumerian theology. Do you think it was destroyed by a crusading army? No, it was dismantled by builders. That's right. Later generations looked at this sacred temple and didn't see the Lord Enlil anywhere. They just saw, oh, so many good bricks. Let's take them to build pigsties and fix house walls. They dismantled the house of the gods, brick by brick, to build their mundane lives. Esagila of Babylon, the great temple of Marduk, suffered the same fate, slowly collapsing and sinking into the muddy ground. Wind blew through empty rooms. Sand filled the halls where kings once knelt trembling. The silence became eternal. By the 19th century, when European archaeologists with pith helmets and iron shovels arrived in this land, the oblivion was thoroughly complete. Local villagers living right on top of those mounds didn't even know what lay beneath their feet. They grazed goats on the heads of the gods. They pitched tents on the bones of the temples. To them, the Anunnaki were not demons nor gods. They were nothingness. The names Enlil, Enki, Inanna had become dead codes, waiting to be deciphered by scholars in museum libraries from crumbling clay tablets. So the question arises, if no one calls their name, no one offers sacrifices, no one remembers. Does a god truly die? This brings us to a tough philosophical problem, and also the key to understanding why I say they are still here. Because the physical death of the temple does not equal the death of the function that God held. That energy doesn't disappear. It just moves house. We have seen how gods die. But let me ask you a question that might give your brain a cramp. What is a god, actually? We modern humans suffer from a disease of dualistic thinking. We think either God is real, sitting on a cloud looking down, or God is fake, invented by humans. Period. But the Mesopotamians? They would laugh in our faces at that naivety. To them, a god wasn't an old man with a beard sitting in the sky. A god was a presence, a source of energy, a piece of software running the universe. The Temple of Enlil in Nippur wasn't Enlil's motel. It was a broadcasting station. The rituals, the offering of beer, bread, the bathing of the statue, none of that was play acting. It was a charging process. When humans stop performing rituals, the broadcasting station loses power. The signal weakens, flickers, and then turns into the static noise of radio interference. Gods don't die biologically. They just get disconnected from the Earth server. But here is the key point. That hair-raising feeling when standing before the divine, what theologian Rudolf Otto called the numinous, does not disappear. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It only transforms from one form to another. The law of conservation of energy is true for physics, and strangely enough, it is also true for religion. When Enlil was disconnected, where did that feeling of fear and reverence go? It migrated. It found a new host. Look at this chilling similarity. In Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki didn't operate alone. They had a divine council. They met, voted or argued, divided power, and determined human fate. It was a bureaucracy, a cosmic government. When monotheism took the throne and declared there is only one God, do you think that bureaucracy was dissolved? Not at all. It was just structurally reorganized. Look at the Bible. Who surrounds the throne of God? In Judaism, we have the Elohim, divine beings in the heavenly court. In Christianity, we have the 9 choirs of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones. A military and administrative hierarchy that is breathtakingly strict. In Islam, angels have specific duties, from recording sins to blowing the trumpet of judgment. Does that look familiar? That is the exact structure of the Anunnaki Council. It is still that model. It is still that psychological need. We humans cannot accept a chaotic universe. We need order. We need ranks. We need a committee to blame or to beg. The Anunnaki never really left. They just changed uniforms. They shed their Mesopotamian robes to put on the dazzling angel wings of monotheistic religions. Their function, as intermediaries, as enforcers of cosmic law, remains exactly the same. Enlil might have lost his name. Marduk might have lost his temple. But their seats on the cosmic board of directors are still there, just occupied by different characters bearing different names. When I spend time researching the Anunnaki, a question I often encounter is, they left, didn't they? That on some beautiful day, the Anunnaki, the architects of human civilization, got sick of this troublesome planet, climbed onto their spaceships and whoosh, flew back to distant planet Nibiru to retire. Too naive. History doesn't operate like a Hollywood movie. There were no tearful goodbyes, nor was there the sound of jet engines tearing through the sky. The truth is much more cruel. They didn't go anywhere. They just changed their shirts. Look at the essence of the problem. When the name Anunnaki became obsolete, when stories about them no longer sold tickets at ancient temples, human spiritual need didn't disappear. It migrated. It's like a parasite finding a new host. The 50 great gods of Sumer didn't evaporate. They fragmented. They became the 70 nations with guardian angels. They restructured into the 9 orders of angels in Christianity. They shape-shifted into the 99 names of God in Islam. You see, we, tiny humans, are always obsessed with infinity, but our brains cannot process infinity. So we need a mold, a structure, and the Anunnaki were the first mold. When that mold broke, we didn't throw away the shards. We used them to cast new ones. And here is history's most ironic joke. Even as new religions tried to destroy the old gods, they inadvertently preserved them. Have you ever wondered why the demons in the Bible have names that sound familiar? Baal, Astarte? Those aren't demons born from hell. Those are old gods that were relabeled. Early Christian demonology was essentially a black mirror. They took the Anunnaki hierarchy, flipped it upside down, and called it hell. A divine council became a legion of demons, but the operating structure, the top-down order, the bureaucratic DNA of the spiritual world, it remained exactly the same. The Anunnaki still live right inside the very book written to erase them. But why? Why change? Why not just keep Enki and Enlil for convenience? The answer lies here. Scale. Imagine you are a guardian god for the city of Nippur. You only speak Sumerian. Your power is tied to the river flowing through your backyard. That's fine if the world is limited to that valley. But then, humans, with bottomless greed, began building empires, trade-connected continents. A local, parochial god who only worried about village affairs was no longer qualified to manage a multicultural empire stretching from the Nile to the Ganges. The gods needed to be upgraded. They needed to become more abstract, more universal. No one wants to worship a god whose power stops at the city limits. Simply put, we outgrew the Anunnaki. Like a child who stops playing with a toy, not because it's bad, but because the child has grown. They need more complex games. The Anunnaki, with specific names, specific temples, specific dietary needs, became too cramped for the ambitions of New Age humanity. But don't confuse obsolete with disappeared. They are still there, hiding in new definitions of God, in the power structures we still follow every day. And if you think the proof of their departure lies in spaceships, you're looking in the wrong place. Let me show you where this secret is actually kept. Not the sky, but under the dust of forgotten clay tablets. Look at this thing. A technology that once held our entire world of data. Is it wrong? No. Is it a hoax? Certainly not. It worked perfectly for the purpose it was created for. But today, it is trash. That is exactly what happened to the Anunnaki. We, modern humans with brains poisoned by sci-fi movies, are always looking for a dramatic ending for them. We want a Star War. We want the good side to unmask the bad side. We want to see Zeus defeat Cronus. But the truth about the Anunnaki's departure is more boring, and because of that, it is more painful. They were fired because they no longer fit the job description. Let's go back to that time. The world was changing at breakneck speed. Independent city-states, the safe havens of individual Anunnaki gods, were collapsing to make way for empires. You cannot rule an empire stretching from Egypt to India with a god who only knows how to sit in Nippur waiting for bread offerings. A local god cannot solve global problems. That is a system error. Trade expanded. Cultures collided. Humanity needed something more efficient. We needed new religious technologies. And notice the word I used. Technology. Monotheism, universal ethics, portable scriptures. Those were the killer technological inventions of that time. They were like the iPhone coming out and killing the landline. Why drag a 5-ton statue everywhere when you can carry the Word of God in a compact scroll, or even right in your head? The Anunnaki performed their role excellently in the world of city-states. They provided order. They legitimized power for petty kings. But when that world ended, they became redundant. However, and this is where the story gets interesting, their body died, but their soul did not. Think about Latin. Does anyone use it to order a pizza? No, it is a dead language. No one speaks it as a mother tongue anymore. But try walking into a court, a hospital, or a biology lab. Latin is everywhere. It lives in the grammatical structure of Romance languages. It lives in how we name animals, in the legal terms that determine your freedom. The Anunnaki left in that same way. They didn't leave. They dissolved into the foundation. What is their nature? It is order. It is hierarchy. It is structure. Humans crave an organized universe. We fear randomness. So even when we threw away the name Enlil or Anu, we kept their chairs. We just put other people in them. The Sumerian divine council became the 9 choirs of Christian angels. The gods governing natural elements became orderly demons in hell. The structural DNA of the Anunnaki still flows vigorously in the theological systems designed to replace them. So the million-dollar question you are all screaming in your heads, Zorro, so are the Anunnaki real or not? Or are they just a figment of imagination? Wrong question, my friend. That question completely misses the point. They are real, just like money is real, just like the law is real. You cannot touch the law. You cannot see the physical value of a $100 bill. It is just paper. But they control your life, shape your behavior, and can kill you or save you. That is cultural reality. The Anunnaki exist inside and through human practice. They are nourished by belief, by rituals, by language. When we stop saying their names, stop performing rituals, that reality dissolves. Not because they never existed, but because the server maintaining their existence, the Mesopotamian civilization, was unplugged. Only data traces remain. Clay tablets lying cold in museums, soulless names in academic catalogs. Each of these fragments is a frozen moment. 4,000 years ago, a real human hand with sweat, with fingerprints pressed into wet clay. Some pieces are only as big as a stamp. Some fit in the palm of your hand. To the average person, these are meaningless chicken scratches. But to those who know how to listen, they are voices screaming. They are beer bills, temple inventory lists, royal hymns, and most importantly, they are the travel diary of a disappearance that no one intended to write. Let's rewind the tape with me. Stop number 1. Sumer, 3rd millennium BC. The Anunnaki are everywhere. They are A-list superstars. Administrative texts list their rations in detail. Bread, premium beer, fatty mutton. Kings didn't dare make a peep without a blue check mark from the Anunnaki. In the Song of the Ho, they are great architects. A tablet from Shurupak records them as supreme witnesses. At this time, no one asked, "Who are the Anunnaki?" It was a truth as obvious as the sun rising in the east. But then, a subtle shift began. By the Akkadian period, the Anunnaki were still there, but they started to be grouped into generic clusters. A hymn dedicated to the goddess Ishtar says she has authority over all gods, and the Anunnaki are just errand boys among them. By the old Babylonian period, oh my, a miserable demotion. In the Epic of Gilgamesh or the myth Inanna's descent to the underworld, the Anunnaki no longer sit on heavenly thrones. They were pushed to the basement. They became judges in the underworld. From CEOs running the universe, they became scribes doing paperwork in the legal department of hell. Still necessary but boring, mechanical, losing the earth-shaking authority of the old days. And by the first millennium BC, the Neo-Assyrian period, they disappeared from billboards. Their names only appeared in copies made by nostalgic scholars, bookworms who wanted to preserve tradition. The new kings only prayed to Marduk, to Asher. The Anunnaki became an antique, a name that sounded fancy on the lips but was hollow of power. But this is the craziest twist of this entire story. In this massive archive spanning 4,000 years, there is not a single tablet. No chronicle records. On day X month Y year Z, the Anunnaki held a press conference and announced their retirement. No line weeps. Alas, the gods have boarded a spaceship and flown to the Orion constellation. The silence is absolute. We, addicts of conspiracy theories and movies, always wait for a grand farewell scene. We imagine space gates slamming shut. We ransack ancient texts to find their plane ticket. And when we don't find it, we scream, "Hidden!" The government destroyed the evidence. The Vatican is hiding the truth. Wake up. That silence is not a conspiracy. It is the answer. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never creatures that could leave. They were not tourists. They were the structure. The clay tablets don't record an evacuation. They record a corporate restructuring that lasted for centuries. Early Anunnaki, the Supreme Board of Directors of independent city-states. Middle Anunnaki, subordinates of imperial gods like Marduk. Late Anunnaki, names in history books, honorary titles with no real power. They didn't fly anywhere. They were outsourced. They were merged. They were forced into early retirement because humanity's business model changed. City-states became empires. Polytheism became monotheism. And in that ruthless meat grinder of history, the Anunnaki simply expired. We didn't see them leave, just like we never held a funeral for pagers or cassette tapes. We just simply stopped using them, and one day we forgot they once ruled the world. So if they didn't go anywhere, if they just dissolved into the civilization that bore them, then what does that mean for us today? We are standing on a pile of ruins asking into the void. But perhaps the answer isn't inside these boxes. It lies right out there, where the wind is blowing through the crumbled mud bricks of Nippur. This is Nippur, or more accurately, its dried corpse. The ziggurat of Enlil, once considered the center of the universe, where the Anunnaki gathered to determine the fate of kings, is now just a pile of crumbled mud bricks. Wind and sand have eroded it for the past 4,000 years. No space gate, no spaceship landing pad, just dust and silence. This same wind blew through here when priests sang hymns at dawn 4 millennia ago. The wind remains, but the gods do not. You see, We spent the previous 3 parts looking for evidence of their departure. But standing here, amidst this desolation, the truth appears naked. The Anunnaki didn't go anywhere. They vanished into us. They died the way Latin died. No one speaks Latin as a mother tongue anymore, but it still lives in legal vocabulary, in plant names, in scientific language. The Anunnaki are the same. Their structural DNA, the idea of a divine council, of top-down order, of a universe that is governed rather than random, never died. It just moved house. From the Sumerian council to Christian angels, from cosmic legislators to heavenly bureaucrats. We just changed the casing, but the operating system kernel remains the same. And this is the funniest thing about our era. Why do millions of people today still believe the Anunnaki are aliens? Why do videos about ancient astronauts have billions of views? That isn't history. That is a reflection of yourself. The Babylonians turned the Anunnaki into bureaucrats because they lived in the era of empires. And us? We live in the era of iPhones, SpaceX, and AI. We are obsessed with technology. Therefore, we look at these old masks and imagine astronauts wearing protective suits. We are doing exactly what the ancients did, creating gods in the image of our current obsessions. Every spaceship hypothesis, every sensational documentary, every debate topic on Reddit, those are modern rituals. We don't offer bread and beer anymore. We offer views, likes, and shares. In a weird way, the Anunnaki still live. We are still feeding them with our attention, just under a different name, a different form. The story of the Anunnaki is not a story about aliens. It is a story about humans, about our desperate need to find order in a chaotic universe. We build gods to serve as pillars. And when the world changes, when the old pillar rots, we don't fix it. We build a new one on top of the old one. The clay tablets beneath my feet hide no cosmic secrets. They just whisper a simple truth. Everything changes, even gods. So, when you turn off this video, don't ask where the Anunnaki went anymore. That question is old. Ask yourself a scarier question. Today, what new gods are we creating? What names are we giving to the invisible forces ruling our lives? Algorithms? Artificial intelligence? The market? And 4,000 years from now, when future archaeologists dig through the ashes of the 21st century, what tablets of ours will they find? Will they look at the rotting servers of Google and Facebook and wonder about the digital gods we once worshipped? History doesn't repeat itself, but it always rhymes. I am Zorro, and this is the Anunnaki Files. Good night, if you can.